Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, Best Practices Managing Client Onboarding. This is a topic that we feel really strongly about at Practice Paradox. Even though we're specialists in digital marketing, we see onboarding as the nexus between your marketing and your operations. So you're in for a treat today. Before I formally introduce our presenter, we're doing this together with Karbon. Now, today's not a demonstration of Karbon. We think it's an incredible piece of technology. It's really a category creator, in my view, and it's an essential piece of kit in our view for a modern accounting firm. So to find out more about it, just note karbonhq.com is where you can go and you can request a demo, because today is not a demo of Karbon as such. And a little later on, just before Q&A with the questions, I'll share with you a new initiative, a new program that we have at Practice Paradox that has evolved from essentially from demand from our clients saying, hey, that marketing masterclass, the 2 days that we spent on strategy, that was brilliant. You need to run that more often. So Strategy Fast Track is a program where we have the next intake starting in January, but a little bit more about that later. Now, today, I'm delighted to be joined by Ian Vacin, who's a co-founder of Karbon and is their VP Education, and apparently goes by other job titles on certain days of the week, he said. So, g'day, Ian. How are you?
Thanks for having me, MC. Appreciate it. Thanks for having us on for this talk today.
Brilliant to collaborate with you guys. We pretty much deal with the same types of accounting firms, the modern, progressive ones who are pushing the envelope and who want to, do the new thing. But I will hand the steering wheel over to you, Ian. I'll keep an eye, everyone, on the questions, but Ian will explain a little bit more about the platform that we're using today. So over to you, Ian.
Appreciate it. So there you go. There's always a wrinkle there. So we're going to start with a little bit of context. We're going to go through a little bit of some client onboarding work that I did with a practice called Rhodes here in the States. And we did about 7 to 8 different iterations on this. And it was the precursor to what we did to create our best practice process around this. And one of the reasons we did this was this particular firm was really trying to struggle in terms of growth. And they found that they just couldn't keep up with the volume coming in, and they couldn't get a good end result on the back end. So at the beginning, they were really within a lot of chaos. And at the end of putting a proper process in place and understanding the importance of it, they were able to amp that up to what they're doing, 6 to 8 onboardings. And now it's even higher overall. So again, if you want to learn about that particular customer's experience and how they did it and a little bit of the background, you can go and check out this URL at the bottom. I do believe we're going to be sending out the slides. So again, you'll be able to click it there, but if not, take a screenshot and you can see and read about that all as well. So let's go into a little bit of what we are today and a little bit of the housekeeping. So we are using Webinar Jam. You'll notice a little bit the interface. There is a questions bar and a chat bar there on the side. You'll notice, again, might be different controls if you're coming from a different technology, but it's relatively the same. If for some reason we sound like robots or slow down, it's probably because you got too many apps open. We can't make this interactive if you don't ask questions. So ask us some questions as we go. We're going to stop and we'll answer them as we can. And then again, we'll have time at the end. And I'm going to have fun. Hopefully you guys have fun. MC's going to have fun. So let's get into it. If you want to learn more about Karbon, we're not going to do a demo. Just like we talked about, it is how work gets done. A little bit of background, where all your email and your communications come together in order to action it. So that way it's not sitting in your inbox, but it can flow such that you collaborate with your team, ultimately understand what needs to be done, how it needs to be done. It all flows into the workflow that you need in order to maintain everything that's going on, and you collectively and collaboratively can work through that. Ultimately, it's customized for whatever you want to do. Maybe it's the work statuses, the templates, whatever you need in order to make sure that work flows through the firm, and ultimately lets you see everything that happens, full visibility across the work, who's doing what, nothing falls through the cracks. And so if you need to see anything, again, in aggregate, you can go ahead and look at the different insights it provides. And then overall, if you want to learn more, we're not going to talk about it today, but you can go to karbonhq.com. There we go. Here is our plan of attack for today. We are talking about all things onboarding. So we're just going to quickly go through a little bit of the reality for what actually happens for a lot of folks. Here in the States, we're turning the fiscal year to hit towards tax. So tax is a really interesting example, the compliance side of things and how people handle the onboarding of that. But we're going to cover onboarding in general too, depending on what your service mix might be. Two areas that we really want to focus on is one of the biggest problems in order to make the onboarding go faster is your clients. They're problematic in the fact of trying to get the information from them so you can set up the various systems or set up the engagement the way you want to have it done. And then the next is really setting a tone for how the client management is going to be. And we're going to talk a little bit about service level agreements, ultimately how you set the cadence of things, training the client. And then lastly, it'll go into, well, what does a workflow around this look like? And then we've got some tips and tricks. So that is our agenda for today. We're going to tick through a lot of slides. The slides are there for you to reference later. So sit back, relax, and we're going to talk you through everything. MC, anything to comment or talk about as we go through this? Otherwise, I'm just going to attack straight at it.
Just briefly, Ian, I've messaged everyone in chat to let them know. Just ask questions in there and we'll keep an eye on it. There are a few little AV hiccups, I think, at the start, but I think everyone's all good to go. So over to you to power on, Ian.
Appreciate it, mate. So I've had about 3 cups of coffee. I talk fast, so I'll try to slow it down a bit. All this slide I want to bring across is when we talk to folks that are doing onboarding, typically on average, it takes 60 to 90 days. That's the point by which you've closed the actual sale and you've then moved into a state where the work is going to happen in a repeating fashion and it's in a cadence of ongoing sort of maintenance and whatnot. And so if you elongate that process, again, most people fit around that 60, 90 days and you really want to be under 30, you're ultimately going to have less revenue. You're going to lose revenue. Your resources are going to be held up longer and you're going to ultimately have lower client satisfaction. And it is a referral-based business. Client onboarding can be a referral vehicle, but it can also be a detractor. So we want to make sure that we have a really good experience end to end, and we can do that as fast as possible in order to maximize the outcomes here. So a couple of the facts about client onboarding. One of the biggest things is there's a lot of back and forth that happens on onboarding. One of them really happens around email. Just to set up a client meeting, for instance, can take a sequence of about 6 to 7 emails back and forth to figure out a time. Perhaps somebody decides they can't make the meeting and reschedule it. You're now in 12 to 14 contacts that go back and forth. And so that email is pretty painful. As we talked about before, clients are going to drag their feet. You just got to ask for something that's quite, a bit more difficult for them to find, or they're not too sure about, and it's just going to stall everything. A lot of you might use client portals. Portals suck, in my opinion. The reason why they suck is it requires a username, a password, and you have to know the URL. And clients can't remember one of those, let alone all 3. And for those of you that are on the compliance side and use the e-organizers, they're thick. They have a lot of things you're asking for someone up front, and they ultimately become a doorstop like the image here. And so again, we want to be smart about how we do that. And again, we're going to walk through that here today. For those of you, I put in a bunch of different sort of slides in here with something for you to think about and something for you to walk away from and reflect after we get done with today's webinar. And one is to think about really how long does it take for you to do your particular client onboarding today, and be really true and honest with yourself, because as you decide to put in a new process, you want to validate that you've actually made huge improvements on that. And so taking stock in what you do today is really important for process improvement. And I want you to then think about the fact that when you're trying to reinvent your client onboarding, you're really going through a process improvement plan to figure out where your bottlenecks exist in the process. And generally in client onboarding, it's really around lag time. And so you want to think about where are you having the most inefficient areas, and that's where you really want to hone in and focus on first. And then you keep refocusing across the process until you can get to your best process you possibly can. And as the example that I talked about beforehand with Rhodes, they've done 40 iterations over 2 years. So that's a lot of iterations. But again, it just goes to the fact that it's a constant journey of improvement. So with all that being said, one of the biggest areas is around info collection. So I want to talk through how can we get the information from our clients as quickly as we possibly can in order for us to move this process along as fluidly as possible. And so I did quite a bit of research around how information is collected and used in games and gamification of things. So I live here in Silicon Valley. I've got a lot of friends that run different gaming companies. And one of the big questions I had was, well, how do you get somebody who is going to come through the game to ultimately spend the duration of time to be able to do, learn how to get it to work, and then ultimately be able to do things that are much more complicated over time? And their explanation is you bring the user and your client across essentially an exponential curve, where you're going to give them the easiest tasks first that take the smallest amount of time, and you're going to build confidence in the fact that they can do what you're asking them and then keep adding those tasks on top. And so if you ask for information progressively and you build the confidence of the particular client that you have across what you need to do, you ultimately will find that they will continue down the path that you want them to give you what you need. And so there's certain things that you ask for in onboarding that are harder than others. Those might be tax IDs. They might be information about the business itself. And what you want to do is ask those towards the back end of the process and not in the front. You want to ask for the easy stuff up front, get them familiar with how to work together, get them confident around that they can answer the questions that you give them, and then progressively keep asking them as you go. And so you're building them across this exponential curve, but it's around ultimately a confidence and learning curve. And so again, think about asking progressively, not just giving someone a huge binder of information to then say, hey, go answer this, because they're ultimately going to stop dead in their tracks. So the next thing on this is it's easier for somebody to validate information than to fill in the blank. So if you look at human behavior, it's easier for you to spot a mistake in information or to look at something that has some syntax given and then figure out where you've seen that before or whether or not it fits you and your business. And so wherever you can, you want to try to fill out the information for the client so that they can validate, not populate. And so a lot of times when we did research on this was you can get about 40 to 50% of the information you typically would need in onboarding just by looking at somebody's presence online, searching their name and looking at social media and those types of things. And you'll get a lot of that detail, and then you can serve that up to them. And so that's going to lower the barriers for people to give you the critical information that you need. And so again, I put up some things here and some points that I've already talked about. But one of the biggest things is if you're asking for something that's sensitive, like a tax ID or anything of that nature, just give them the syntax. In the States, for instance, we have a social security number. It's 3 digits, a dash, 2 digits, a dash, 4 digits, and just put XXX-XX-XXXX. Again, there's other sort of information that you might need. And so again, go ahead and give the syntax, and then they can fill in the details because it'll remind them where they've seen that before. Next one is set a goal and a critical path. So inside of client onboarding, there are a lot of times you can do things in parallel, and it doesn't have to be in series, all the different steps that you need to have done. You can ask for some information, just a bare level of information, possibly just to get access to their financials, maybe to get some criteria of what systems they want to set up, and you can start working through that. But you don't necessarily need all the information from the client to do all those underlying activities. And so you want to be smart about what are the things I have to ask in sequence that define the duration of the client onboarding process, and be very, very mindful of those and maniacally try to make sure that you're asking for that information along the path, because everything else can be done in tandem. And so that's what we mean by understanding the critical path. And by setting the goal is something that is owned not just by you, the practitioner, the accountant in the equation, but it's also owned by the client. And so there needs to be a mutual understanding of this is when we're going to start, this is where we're going to finish. This is my role, this is your role, this is what I'm going to need you to do in this time frame, and this is what we're going to be able to provide. And so having clarity around that and then walking through what the critical steps are helps both parties understand how best to work together and leads to a better outcome. So this is an example of the onboarding that we did, again, with that first example earlier. Just looking through again, what were the steps and what were the order? And you can see there that steps C through C, D, E, F, H, and ultimately, not J, but I at the end of there, that is the critical path. And those were the times that were required in order to finish this process. And those other things fed into the process and ultimately happened as an outcome of different steps. And so, again, just a simple map of looking how all the stuff comes together can help pinpoint what are the areas that you really want to care about. And again, if you look at this, I can see that C, setting up new partner systems in this case, took 11 units of time to finish. This is an area that I should focus on and trying to speed up because it's going to have the largest impact across that critical path. So again, this isn't a process improvement discussion, but again, I just want to let you think about the fact you want to dissect this problem down and to think about where do you spend your time and where does lag time exist. The next one is in be clear on the deadlines and the penalties. So remember that your resources are held up in this process in order to get someone across the line and fully onboarded and ready to go. And again, you can work with the client on both the carrot and the sticks. You can give them incentives and you also can give them penalties. Some folks will go ahead and provide, ultimately not just provide better service in terms of getting somebody on and running, but maybe there's the onboarding's charged for and they'll give a discount if it's done quicker because the information is given to them in a more speedy fashion. Others will say, if you don't meet the deadlines, but giving us the information that we have here, we're ultimately going to delay the onboarding by X number of days because we just don't have that and we've had to move the resources elsewhere. The carrot and the stick approach is just to be clear on what happens because you want to make sure the client understands that it's not a fluid situation, that there's obviously a step pattern to this and we want them to follow that and work with us in tandem together. Again, it's a team and they're part of the team and we need to work together in order to get that done. So the last one is, if you really want the client onboarding path to go as quickly as possible, you need to think of every way possible to make it as easy as it can for the client. So this is around maybe educating them on where the information might be. It might be not relying on them to get back to you in the set number of days that you said, but maybe reminding them and probing them along the process or assisting them or offering to help them out. Again, the more that you're top of mind, the more that you're responsive on their questions, the more engaged they're going to be. So you want to think about, how do I lower the barriers? How do I stay engaged? How do I get them, after they've done an action, to do the next action? And again, it really comes down to making it as easy as possible overall. So with that, these are some things to think about. And MC, I don't know if we've had any questions, or again, you might have some thoughts before we go to the next section. But some things to think about here is, what is the information that you really want to ask for, that you really must have at the beginning of the client onboarding process, versus what is the stuff that you can wait to get? And so how can you break that information apart so you can ask for just what you need versus asking for it all? And then the other one is, where creatively can you get information for the client on their behalf in order to pre-populate so that they're not having to do all the work? Again, there's different ways to be able to get that information, and have you explored all those? And then again, have you had those conversations on how to engage them to have the most fluid onboarding process possible? All right, let's get into the next section then on client management. So it's not just about the data gathering, but it's how are you going to interface with the client here and now, tomorrow, and all the way through the client onboarding process, because it really sets the tone of the entire relationship, not only in the moment, but for years to come. So if you have a bad experience at the beginning of a process, it's going to always be in the back of your mind later. So no matter how hard you might work on the monthly servicing that you do, or advisory, or whatever it might be, again, it's all going to be anchored by what happens in the client onboarding process. I could even argue it's going to happen also from the sales process, but we're not talking about that particularly today. So again, think about the fact it's a client's going through an experience, and there's different curves and valleys and peaks, and you want to make sure you maximize the peaks. So the first step on this, on client management, is really setting the expectations up front with the client and being really crystal clear again on who does what does the process look like. Invite them into your process. Walk them through how you do what you do, because once they're able to see that, they're going to appreciate how much it takes and ultimately what you're doing on their behalf. And so I put up these 5 different statements that are really things that you want to think about, and ultimately things that are going to be said back and forth with a client in that sort of setting expectations point in the process. And so the first one then is, this is our processes, this is what we use, this is how we work. And again, it's not necessarily that you can't incorporate and encompass the different systems that the client might have. That might be an arrangement, but this is how we work with those systems. This is how we work with our clients. This is how we do this, and this is how we make sure we get you guys the best outcomes, and this is how we're able to do it at the cost and the servicing that we provide. So let's just let's just lay it out on the table a bit, so that way you understand what particularly goes into all of this. The next one I think is really key is, remember, this is a team activity, a team sport in terms of client and the trusted advisor, and so your partner's in that. If one side decides to drag their feet, the other side can't get the work done. And again, both actually end up losing in the equation. And so they're a part of your team, you're a part of their team. And so how do we, in concert, ultimately work together to get to the best endpoint, which in this case for onboarding is, how do we get started to work on what we signed up to do with you as quickly as possible? Here's how we can get there. Next is to be clear on what's your work, what's our work, and how it comes together. So that way the client is informed enough to know that when you're asking for X, Y, and Z, they know that they need to get that to you as soon as possible, and they understand the reason why. Because if they understand that, they're more apt to, or they're going to have a quicker response, and you're going to be able to thin out that lag time that's going to exist. There's things that are in scope, there's things that are out of scope. This gets folks in a lot of trouble where you ultimately start down the client onboarding path, and ultimately things were assumed that were included that were not included. And so it's actually not just about a conversation at the start about what you're going to do, but also have a conversation about what you're not going to do. A lot of folks will ultimately, from a bookkeeping standpoint, as used as an example, will go through and say, okay, once we get the information, once we set up your books, we'll be off and running. We can do the monthly bookkeeping, payroll, whatever it might be. But there typically, becomes this cleanup exercise that needs to occur. And if that is not discussed up front, then it's expected that from the client's perspective that was something you were going to have to take on. And it creates an adversarial relationship and conversation right in the middle of onboarding, which sets the whole relationship in a bad light. So spend the time and the due diligence around what's included, what's not. Make sure the staff know that as well. MC?
Yeah, I love the fact that you're emphasizing that point, Ian. Over the years, we've always talked to our members about, with scope, you need to educate clients about the concept of scope, because in the benchmarking data over the years from various businesses, there's actually not been a good correlation between firms that were doing a high percentage of fixed price, and people shouldn't use the word fixed because that's the main word that the clients get in their head is it's fixed. Well, it's obviously not a fixed price, because if the scope changes, the price is going to change. But to educate them about the fact there is a scope, what's in it, what's outside it, and what will happen when outside of scope items arise through the year, which is normal, and to prepare them for that conversation. Because I think a lot of scope creep comes from a fear of confrontation. They think, they've asked us to do this little bit. Oh, it'll only take half an hour, half a day later. It's been done. And because there was not the collaborative communication right at the start, like you're suggesting here, the advisor just didn't want to go there, and they'll either be write-offs or worse. And write-offs in a way don't even exist if you value pricing, but advisors in a firm will hide that from the principals and directors. They'll do overtime and they'll get it through. So it's a lose-lose situation. So love what you're saying there around scope, Ian.
Yeah, and again, if the scope creeps up and you end up doing work, then you've actually trained the client that they can get more out of you than what you agreed to do. And it just becomes a situation of where you're going to get diminishing profits quicker and quicker and quicker from that given client.
And the advisory team can get resentment about that. They feel undervalued, and the clients don't appreciate what they don't pay for, do they?
Nope, exactly.
So just want to chime in on that one. I'll keep an eye. Everyone send through questions in chat. No questions too big picture or too specific. Let loose.
Yeah, again, I can't be doing that good of a job, guys. So ask the questions. I can help out. And that goes back to what you were saying, MC, which goes back to the last one, which is make sure there isn't any surprises. What I find really, really interesting because I look at processes almost every day now, and if you really have a good understanding of how your client onboarding works, and you're mapping it out, and you're looking at it how it works from engagement to engagement, pretty quickly within a series of essentially 8 to 10 onboardings, you start to get all the variations that can exist and all the side activities and side projects and scope creep activities that pop up. And you can actually see where all those things can come off of the client onboarding process. And you can actually then use that as an education point to the client saying, well, these are the types of things that might come up. And if they do, this is how we're going to handle it. So we're going to see as we work through the details. And if that does come up, we'll have a conversation and we'll address it then. But again, if you have surprises in the process, only bad things are going to happen. So you want to make sure that you minimize those as best you can and be upfront with the client, because again, they're going to appreciate that. It's just going to set the tone for everything else. So the second one here is to be really clear on how the two, you and the client, are going to collaborate together. So there's a term we use in tech called SLAs, but those are service level agreements. You need to have your own service level agreements with the client. So there's actually there's a firm out in New Zealand there, Wise Advice. Some of you might know who that is. And again, I have the other one, which is Rhodes. But both of these firms have what I would consider to be high volume of clients on a pretty good, on a monthly fee that they're charging. That they make really good money doing so. But the way that they're able to execute that is they set up these rules by how to engage back and forth with one another, so that they're not picking up phone calls in the random hours of the night. They're not taking any sort of random, conversation or whim that the particular owner might have that's then sidetracking the entire accounting practice overall. And so we'll look at these two here in a little bit more detail, but you want to, from the beginning of the client onboarding, be clear on how to communicate, what sort of pattern is acceptable, and what are the expectations around this. You need to, again, in some instances, you can be a little bit harsh. Again, on one of these examples, on one of these firms, they'll actually say, look, we'll fire you as a client if you don't follow the guidelines by which we do it, because it's a disservice to the other clients. And again, if they did that and I was trying to serve you, it would be a disservice to you. Now, that's a bit heavy-handed, but what it does is it sets the tone by, you got to operate this way, and it allows for you to come back and say, look, you didn't do what we told you. You need to fall in line, because it's the best way that we can service you in the long term. And so, again, we have a business and we serve other folks as well, but we're really attentive to you, and we want to make sure we serve you when you need us the most. And again, your actions ultimately drive what they're going to do. If you decide to pick up the phone at 2 in the morning and take the call, the next time it's 2 in the morning, they're going to call you again. And so you have to be clear with what's acceptable, what's not, and your pattern is going to teach them what they can and can't do. So the example on the left was really just being clear on when you email, when you call, when you text. So again, if it's an emergency, give us a call. We'll help you out. Again, it has to be an emergency. If it's something you need us to be attentive to, pretty quickly, we'll do same day, but you got to text us, because that allows to signals us. But again, it's not an emergency, so we're going to take 24 hours. Anything else, we'll handle it based on the priority of it, but it has to go through email. And again, in this case, it was, you don't follow it, maybe you're not the right client for us, or we're not the right practice for you. On the Rhodes side, they actually set up their office hours, and they said, look, we're Monday through Friday. We work from 8 to 6, or I think it's 8 to 5. And you put a request in, we'll get back to you, and we'll help solve it for you in about 2 to 3 hours. So that's our response time. So again, call, leave a message, we'll get back to you. They actually use a service called Ruby Receptionist, which actually is an outsourced receptionist technology. They then go ahead, they take the information, and then they transcribe it, and it sends an email. So everything goes to email anyways. Saturday and Sunday, they say, look, we're not going to help you. It's going to be on Monday. So expect if you do that. Same turnaround if you call or email, but it has to be an emergency. And then the last one is respond before you assist, meaning what they're doing is before you're actually going to take an action, respond on email, set the tone before you actually jump in and get the work done. So that's an internal policy. All right. Next one is one account management contact. So for particular firms, and what I recommend is there needs to be that go-to person for the given client. If you have multiple departments servicing a given client, so you might have someone that's doing the advisory work, another one that might be doing compliance, another one that might do the monthly bookkeeping or accounting services, one person across that needs to be the main point of contact. And the reason for that is the client just doesn't know who to go to, so they're going to go to the one that's the most responsive. which probably isn't the one that actually is going to be able to solve the problem for them. And it creates a lot of chaos inside your organization. And so by at least putting one person, doesn't matter which of those three that I mentioned, it could be an overarching account manager, it stops the internal chaos and allows for the client to be heard and then have it directed to the right resource to get the job done. So again, it allows the client to always just know the one place to go, but it also allows you to triage inside your own organization. So next one here, train the clients on how to work with you overall. I cannot stress this one enough. If you think that the client knows how to upload documents to your particular portal, you might be, and again, surprised by the fact that how many actually don't know how to do that. And it's not that they don't want to, but your clients have a million other things to worry about than understanding how your systems particularly work or how your processes work. And so you need to be able to walk in their shoes and think about, okay, how can I make this as easy as possible? If I want them to do something, let me show them. Again, they'll tell you whether or not you're going too granular, but don't assume that they're going to know the right way to work with you. So I put up a 5 different points on this, which is so on the training side, it starts in the sales process. It exists in your first kickoff call, and you should be training each and every time. Every time you have a meeting with a client, it's an opportunity to teach. The more you teach, the more they learn, the more they respect you as someone by their side, helping them day in and day out. Every person learns differently. Some people like video. I'm on video. Some people like webinars. Other people like to read. Other people don't want to read or watch a webinar, and they just want to try something and be directed to remember the technology or whatever it might be. And some people want to be completely hands off. You have to understand what that learning pattern is and be able to work within that, because you can't force somebody to go down a path that they're not comfortable with. And again, you're serving them, not the other way around. You need to have a plan. If you've done this, whoops, sorry, you got a dog. It goes live. 1 second.
Personally, I think there should be more dogs in business. I love it when I go to the States, and there are dogs everywhere in the States. They're in offices, they're in the airports.
Yeah,
I want to see that in more cultures. Love my dogs.
Anyways, we're live. This is what happens. So anyways, going back into the plan, once you've done a few of these, you start to understand the pattern by which to do the training, and you can formulate a plan just from doing it enough times. And so if you come to the actual client and you walk them through, this is how we go through step A to Z when we do our onboarding. It's 30 days. We're going to meet every week. We're going to send you, this is the guidelines. We're going to then train you how to actually submit the information. We're going to walk you through how to get in your books and the different areas you need to look at and so forth. They feel really confident. It's a really big moment for them because they feel like they can do this. They can feel like they can get ahead of it. They can work with you. And it reinforces everything that they've actually already signed up to pay for, or hopefully they've already paid for. So it reinforces all of that hard work. Next one is, whenever you have a meeting, make sure you schedule another one in the moment. So we do this internally in Karbon. If I'm on a call with you and we're having let's say it's our second onboarding meeting, I will at the end of the call make sure I schedule the next one. Do not let a moment go by where you're not moving the client down to the next step within the journey that they're going through. Salespeople do this really, really, really well. And we, as ultimately serving the client, need to make sure that we're keeping ourselves on task and making sure each one of those touch points is already scheduled. Again, send a reminder, and then ultimately make sure the dedicated time is there for us to collaboratively work together to get through the onboarding. And then the last one is, there's the ABCs of sales, always be closing. Inside of client onboarding, it's the ABTs, always be training. The more and more you can do in this, the more they're going to appreciate what you're bringing to the table, and then be confident that they made the right decision and that ultimately the relationship's just going to sing after we get through that client onboarding. Okay, next one is, this one was added in over the last, when I've done this over the last 6 months, I've added this one in because I've seen a lot of practices do this really well. And it's really putting down what your standing operating procedures are. This makes you look really professional. It also gives the client something that they can have that's tangible, and they can understand how to do the activities that maybe that you're doing for them, but also the activities that maybe they're signing up for them. So, ultimately people get nervous about sharing, but again, when you ultimately share what you do, the client's going to appreciate how much work it is and how they don't want to do that, and that they're going to rely on you to do that. And now they understand and have confidence on what that process is. So again, I've seen this a couple times and it's worked really well, where they provide the standard operating procedures and ultimately they use it as the training doc as they go through the client onboarding, but it's something that the client can hold on to and again, reference, or again, provide something that's of substance in that client onboarding process. The last one, and one of the most interesting insights we had on the research that we did with this, and this is actually from what we did at Karbon when we were working on some of the features that we were building out, but those who use a dedicated onboarder have the fastest client onboarding times of any firm. And there's a really, really, really key reason around this. And for those of you that are smaller firms and you just don't have a dedicated body to put towards this, then you want to put dedicated time. You want to basically lock out maybe a Thursday or a Tuesday, maybe both days, and put a couple hours each day that you're always going to focus on moving onboarding work forward during those time frames. And here's the reason why. Client onboarding is a series of back and forth between you and the client. When the client does an action and they send you what you want or you have a confirmation, you've now, once you've gotten that information, created lag time that could possibly exist, because your critical path is defined by really the actions of what the client is supposed to provide you, because it's a heavy document gathering and information gathering process. So every time a response comes back from the client, there should be an immediate response back asking them to do the next activity or the next task. And that's what kills the lag time that sits in that process, which is a bulk of the time spent in that typical 60 days that you might have being spent. And so when you have a dedicated onboard resource, they're going to get back to the client as quickly as possible, because anytime something's coming in, they're trying to address it back. So that's why those client onboardings can get down to essentially, for some folks to do it really well, within 2 weeks or less. And that's because all the lag time is destroyed, removed from the process. So if you don't have the flexibility of having someone dedicated, put dedicated time aside so you don't push it to the side as all these other burning issues happen in your practice. But ultimately, you make sure that you're moving those clients into your practice as fast as you're serving the ones that you're serving today. So a couple of takeaways on this one. So think about and take a step back. What expectations are you setting currently with clients? What behaviors have you demonstrated that might be the behaviors you don't want to have happen? And you can see that based on the things that may irritate you. You wonder why clients are doing things a certain way. But think about what your involvement might have been in that and how ultimately you might do it a different way. Look at those in the firm. And again, there's always going to be those that are folks who are going to instantly respond when the client reacts. And that's not always the right behavior. And so I'm at fault in that. I want to be providing the best customer service. But again, that's not necessarily what we want to be doing. We want to make sure that we're servicing them well, but we're doing it in the situation, the barriers of what's realistic and what's sustainable for the practice overall. What are your service level agreements? What are the rules by which you govern the relationship? Have you communicated that? Have you put it down on paper? Have you walked anyone through it? Do you abide by it? Definitely worth time to look and put that down and think about what makes the most sense for you and your firm. And then how are you going to put that dedicated time aside to make sure that you're moving those onboardings through the process as fast as possible? Again, how are you ensuring you're giving enough attention so that ultimately at the end of the day, you're not dropping the ball and adding all that lag time that you want to make sure that it's eliminated. All right. So we have gone through the information. We talked about client management. Now I want to share a little bit of the workflow that's been created around this and a little bit of the depth so you can see kind of how this plays out in a firm similar to yours, possibly. So here's a couple of examples overall to take a look at. These two were two that I worked with previously. Again, everybody's process is slightly different. What I will say is while the naming might be different, there's typically the same sort of phases and approach that happens here. So this is a firm, and both these firms actually, interesting enough, are from Canada. But one, it's really around they're initiating the engagement, they're doing the capture, they're setting up the systems, and then they're ultimately going ahead and doing the advisory and moving on to the ongoing work. The person down below, it's a similar process, but again, it's more granular. And again, they have a different sort of terminology, but relatively the phases are the same. So those are two examples. What I really want to get to is this particular thing. And there's a critical component to this that I want you to think about. So this is a standard sort of project plan that you might do for your onboarding process. And so this has been moved up to a high level. It's saying, what are the objectives? Well, the objectives for this onboarding were really about setting up the books correctly and making sure the client is confident that they're being taken care of. We had a goal. We knew how long we were doing it beforehand. It was 30 days. And we wanted to move it down into 2 weeks. Every project has to have an owner. So we've got an owner, a driver, an approver. And then we've mapped out the milestones. We're going to ultimately have a proposal that's signed. We're going to sign the resources internally. We're going to have the meeting, get the system set up, gather the financials, make sure they're all ready to go. And we're going to educate and then collaborate to get everything done. So those are the milestones. There's a few other ones that didn't fit on the slide. But that key moments one is really, really important to think about. Those key moments are looking through the process from start to finish, and what does the client say on each major step of the process? Are they involved? And what do they think about what's happening? Are you engaging with them? And what do you want them to say as you're working through those major steps? And so this is a series of the statements that the client would say as we're working with them through that client onboarding. And again, the reason why we want to think about this is the client onboarding, it's the first experience with your practice. And most of the time people do it offline away from the client and they're not involved. And so they're confused on, why am I providing this information? What is my outcome? You come back to me at the end of this thing advising me on it, but I didn't feel engaged or working with you throughout the process. So you want to make sure that while it might be a heavily internal process for your firm, it needs to be externalized so that you bring the client through the process. And so in this one, again, I'm ready to get started. I feel confident in my decision ultimately moving forward with this firm. I can do this. I know how we're going to work together. Wow, they got my books in order. Again, this is the statements for this particular firm. I understand what my state of my books were in, and now I feel confident I can move forward with this. I feel like Rhodes is part of my team. Wow, that was easy. And so we mapped those to the major process steps, and we wanted to make sure that we had a way that we were communicating back out to the client so they could see what was happening, but then they could also get their questions answered and make sure they were fully involved. So then again, the process that all mapped to, and this is something to take a look at, this is how we ultimately mapped for a bookkeeping firm that was primarily on monthly bookkeeping, but they did have some advisory, which was how do we get them from the start of or the end of the sales process, which is that first bucket, and then ultimately all the way around to their monthly bookkeeping that they, the package that they signed up for. And you can see here, there's a couple of interesting things. There's a couple paths that, again, are working in parallel. And so we ultimately know that the meeting with the client, the chasing of the docs, and the setup of the financial systems, that was the critical path. The assignment and setup of the admin systems, that took no time. So we weren't going to focus on that. We were going to focus on that other path because that's where we're wasting a lot of time, and that dictates the duration of the process. And you can see down there's a critical decision step. We talk about this up with the client at the beginning, which is to say, once we get a chance to ultimately create your profit and loss, we're able to understand the depth of your financials to a point where we can assess whether or not we're going to have to do cleanup work or whether or not we can move on in the process to ultimately create a working general ledger. And so that's the critical moment. And we're going to have a meeting around that because if we have to do a cleanup process, it's outside the scope, and we'll then be able to assess what it's going to cost in addition. Again, no surprises. And again, using this process to show this is how we're going to get from where we are today and in 14 days to be able to service you on a monthly basis in your bookkeeping. So again, a good little illustration of how that actually flows. And so from a takeaway perspective, do you even know from a perspective of what your onboarding looks like? Have you taken the time to just scratch it down on a notepad maybe, or put it in Excel, or maybe you're using a workflow system, maybe not. but have you actually taken the time to look at each one of those steps and question whether or not those are the right steps? Are there too many steps? Can you thin it out? What would you do? What could you or should you or wish you could incorporate in that process or take away? Again, thinking about it objectively. And this is a cross-functional team exercise. Those who live in it every day are the ones that have the most insight. And if you look at the process that multiple people do, look for where there's variation in it, where one person does it one way and someone does another. That's where you're going to find your best points of innovation in the process, is where those variants exist, because folks are having to figure out creative ways to make it go faster. And then the other thing I wanted to, the key takeaway on this particular webinar is we've talked about a lot of stuff, and your best thing is to pick one thing on that whole set of arguments that I made that you can put in place now and see about measuring the change that it has, and just try to take some action going forward to increase your client onboarding experience for your clients. And ultimately, it's going to serve you and your business well as well. And that'll get you the proof you need to be able to do the second and the third and the fourth improvement along the process. So again, just on a side note, if you do want to do that, for instance, in Karbon, this is what it looks like. Ultimately, when you do take a process like that and you move it into a workflow, again, you need to be thoughtful about how to map a actual process to a workflow. They are different. And so again, a couple of things to think about, again, whether it's in Karbon or not, is that first sales handoff. You need to be really clear about when sales ends and when onboarding begins, and make sure the baton is passed between those two sides of the house, because typically it's not the same person, and you don't want to have unnecessary dead time there, because the client's just given their credit card, they've just paid, they want action immediately. So you want to make sure that's really seamless. The next is you can use systems to ultimately gather the information for you and nag the client. So look for things that can do client tasks that can ultimately go and do that heavy lifting for you, so you can focus on getting the work done and not necessarily doing the chase. Again, with the system setup part, you've got about 1 million, you may have like 5 or 6 systems that you have to go through. Just be thoughtful of the fact that typically you're going to set them all in one, you're going to set them up in one go. So ultimately, don't create a whole ton of tasks. It really should kind of sit within one or a bunch of subtasks. And one of the things is to document these things as you go. For those of you that are going to use a dedicated onboarding person, that can typically be a pretty grinding job. And so a lot of firms, what they'll do is that is a entry position, that if you come into the firm and you're a new hire, you're going to do that rotation for 3 months, and then you're going to go move off, do something else. And so it's not only just sharing the load, but it's a good way to train somebody and ultimately get them involved. But you want to document how it's done, because you might have a large number of people flowing through that are uneducated, and you want to make sure that they understand how to do it. And you can use that also to capture the information that you might be doing on the multitude of meetings that you're going to have. And then be smart about the fact that you saw in there's some decision notes that exist, and that's around that scope creep issue. And so you want to make sure you model those correctly. All right, some tips and tricks. So I got a couple slides here on that, things that we've learned along the way, things to take into account. Got a tips and tricks slide. There we go. So specifically on onboarding, it's best when you're dealing with, we talk about on value pricing that you give folks options. We do packages. And the reason for giving people options is you want to allow for someone to be articulate about what they want and how they want it, and then allow them to guide you to what is the best area to go for, so you can, craft that in the moment. And so training works the same way, which is show the different options by which they can learn and work with you, and give them let them have the choose your own adventure, and then work with them as they figure out what is the best way that they want to learn. Be crystal clear. I can't be crystal clear enough about being crystal clear. You've got to be really upfront and very honest with the client about what's included and what's not. Again, don't let things to be assumed, because there's an adage about that, and I'll let you fill in the blanks there. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't let them be afraid to ask questions. Again, the more questions that are asked, the more confidence that's built. And so you're not going to have all the answers. They're not going to have all the answers. And encourage that question process to happen, So that way you're not surprised by what you may have missed because they were holding back, because they just didn't feel comfortable in the environment to share. Meet regularly. Again, once a week probably is the best cadence. But again, in that early stage of getting the documents and clarity, it's not necessarily about having the meeting, but having the dialogue. So you want to have that conversation quick, and again, making the progress through it. And again, think about it. It's collaboration, and collaboration requires clear roles and responsibilities, and again, trust. And so you're trying to build that up as you're going through. Next 5 tips is client onboarding serves itself well with a really clear process. It's good for the client. It's good for your organization. And so spend the time to figure out how to standardize it, because every client is going to go through an onboarding process. It might have variations. That's fine. You can map those out and you can customize it for types of clients, but you need to have a really, really, really clear process. That's the only way you're going to get it down from whatever the time it is today to most likely you could probably get it done in half the time. Expectation setting, we've covered that off already. Communication, client onboarding is all about communication. Make sure you're having it day in and day out. Make sure you're having it early in the process and building from it. Again, on the process side, make sure you have it, iterate on it, continue to refine it. Again, we did 40 iterations with the firm I was talking about. Again, you probably should be doing it quarterly. And then get a system. Getting a system really helps make sure that you can do this programmatically and again, not miss anything and ultimately have all the inputs in one place. So with that said, we're in the wrap up of this overall. I know I've spoken a lot and give you a lot of things to think about, but really what we covered was on the onboarding side was there's a lot of dead time. There's a lot of, it's a really moment to impress the clients and really anchor them to, something that you want to deliver a great customer service experience, and that's ultimately going to translate to referrals. And the 2 areas that we can have the biggest improvements is that data gathering, client management, and again, we looked at some of the workflow. So MC, you came on. Thoughts?
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for that, Ian. We've got a couple of questions and we've got time to address them. So I'll start with the most recent question because it relates to point 2 on the screen now. Andrea asks, don't clients prefer one request for information rather than multiple requests? And Rebecca chimed in, yeah, I think one request eliminates back and forth. I really liked your principle of get them to validate information you've already collected anyway, rather than get them to populate blank fields. Love that. But you talked about that progressive collection. Do you want to talk to that point for Andrea and Rebecca?
Yeah, so I'll tell you that if generally in this process, you're going to have a series of maybe 10, 15, 20 things that you're going to ask for. We actually did a test where we took and we asked every one of those things one by one. And repeatedly over and over again, we got a faster outcome by asking it one by one than we did asking for the whole set. Now, if the whole set is 3 or 5 different, unique tasks and they're quite small, yeah, grouping together makes sense. But in client onboarding, typically there are some harder things that the client has to do, and it takes them some time to go find it and figure it out. So what you've now done is you've taken a hard task and you've set let's say there was 5 tasks and there's one hard one. The other 4 will not be returned to you until the 5th one is figured out. And so that's why you want to break it up, understanding what's easy and what's hard. And that might be the break that you have is just 2 things, easy and hard. But don't have the hard thing stall the entire process.
To add our experience on that, Ian, and the key word that I heard there, Andrea and Rebecca, was test. It's contextual, isn't it? Just see what works best with you and your clients and how much information you need to gather. You absolutely, you want to avoid overwhelming someone. And the fact that your point there, Ian, if they've got 4 of the 5, well, you're not going to see 4 of the 5 until they get the 5th, whereas you could have internally moved ahead with those other 4 pieces of information. So the other thing that I think is really important, I love your diagram of the flow chart. We teach our members to use swim lane flow charts where you can see, what's the client doing, what's technology going to be doing, what are different team members going to be doing. So you can just kind of get a nice visual on that. But, you want to automate as much as you can, but then bring it back and go, well, are there some steps there that we could automate? but we choose to just pick up the phone and make it a bit of a high touch step. What's your comment, Ian, on balancing the high tech versus high touch, as they say?
I think so. I think your process should be standardized, and it has to flex for the customization, the personalization you want to provide. We actually have that as a mantra from our own software, where it starts from a base template, but then it can change based on the client's way that they want to be interacted with. I think, again, we're in a situation where we're not trying to go for the bottom and provide the cheapest service in the market. We're typically trying to provide a higher level of service, which is going to cost at a premium. And because of that, we need to be willing to spend a little extra time on nurturing the client, picking up the phone, writing a thank you card at the end of the process. Again, all those little things that you do will ultimately spike the referral side of this, which happens at the end, and that is an outcome of great service up front. So it's not about rushing someone through so you can get to the monthly bookkeeping. It's about doing it right, but not wasting time within that. And so there are things that you want to step back and take a moment. I believe that every one of those meetings should be, if you can't be doing it live or you can't face to face, should be on a video call like this. When you can see somebody and react to their image and have that dialogue that's open and it's not hidden behind a black screen, that's going to give you a better, they're going to know the person that's behind what they're doing, and they're going to have a gravitation towards that. So spend the extra time, in my opinion.
Another phrase you used, Ian, that I loved is invite your clients into your process. Like, be transparent and show them this is the process. This is what we'll be doing. This is what you'll be doing. Here are the channels of communication. Here are the deadlines. So it really is a collaborative process. I love that philosophy and the reality of that. A couple of more questions before we wrap up. Amelia asked earlier on, does anyone charge for onboarding? I have a comment on that, but you first, Ian.
Yes, I actually know firms that will charge for it up front. It depends on what type of services you're providing and the type of firm. So I don't think it's one or the other, but it's what's right for you. Some people will include it in, and they'll actually mark it off in terms of what the value of it was. It really depends on the type of firm. But I would say most of the time, if it's a simple one, it's not being charged for. It's when it's complicated or there's worry about it, then it's broken apart.
And if it's embedded with education or advice through the process, you could discreetly price it and package it. But yeah, in general, my view is definitely cost it from a bottom-up costing versus a top-down pricing. So bottom-up costing, just work out how many hours of different team members' time is it going to take to deliver. And it's just part of your package. You just build that in. But I don't think explicitly breaking it out, if the client's not going to see that it adds value above and beyond getting them on board, I don't think they would see it as value if it wasn't educational. This leads to another.
Well, I was going to give you a caveat to that. So I'll bring up why that came up. If you're clear on where you understand where what's in scope and what's out of scope, and you can clearly identify the things that are out of scope, then the client onboarding should be included in, because when you get into these sort of bad variants that exist, it's a conversation about how we're going to reprice this or what those things are going to be. But those that don't have that sort of scenario, and again, you're dealing with clients with high variation, and again, a lot of unknown things, those are the ones that generally had a price up front for client onboarding, which is more for discovery, not for onboarding, because they didn't know enough of the engagement.
Yeah, great point. And that use of discovery, we talk to firms about, you can actually do what's commonly called paid discovery in different industries, where if your sales process, pre-onboarding, when you're establishing fit, adds value, you can charge for that. Yeah. Quite legitimately, and people are happy to if they're learning things, if you're identifying what their gaps are, what their issues and opportunities are, in form of helping them do one-page plans or whatever it might be. That discovery process can definitely be paid for because it does add value.
Yeah,
you don't have to, but you can. So David asks, Ian, significant content on education and training. Does this form part of your fee quote engagement? Because if it's free, there's no value.
No, I think so.
Again, half a comment, half a question.
Yeah. So my feeling is that the training ultimately serves you well in the long haul, because they're going to appreciate what you do. They know how it's done. They're not going to do it because they're hiring you to do that anyways. but they're confident in how you're going to get it done. And now they're going to be more collaborative to getting you what you need, and ultimately maybe taking more things on themselves and still paying the same price. A better educated client ultimately leads to a better outcome collectively in what I've seen time and time again.
Undoubtedly. And on that testing, if you test data information and education tools, including sending them pre-filled forms that they can just check and validate, as Ian said, versus phone calls and live web meetings versus screencasts, using tools such as Loom, where you can send them a video. And often people, not all learning styles, but a lot of people think, okay, because that was a visual and I had to find a piece of information and you show me on screen how to do it, you can embed those into your emails. And we show firms how they can use tools like Infusionsoft and ActiveCampaign to do onboarding. In fact, at our masterclass 2 weeks ago, Sarah Stein from Miss Efficiency just spontaneously shared with the group how she has highly automated her onboarding now using ActiveCampaign. So a series of steps, a series of reminders and communications to the client, and included things that blow the clients away, those little value adds, surprises, etc. And I said to her, how much time does this save you in your business, having designed out your onboarding process and automated elements of it? She said, well, it saves many hours, but importantly, things get done that probably otherwise wouldn't have been happening systematically and may have been an afterthought later. Everyone was blown away by that. So I think the huge takeaway for everyone today is make sure that you consciously think through, design and prioritize your onboarding and then apply the frameworks that Ian shared today. So let's just wrap up, if you like. Ian, I'll throw to you to just wrap up, and then I'll let people know about the strategy fast track.
Yep. So again, we just start with a quote, you end with a quote, but this really comes back down to being intentional about your onboarding. And that's what you just said. So that's what this quote is saying as well. And then ultimately, if you want to learn about the system side of this, go check us out at karbonhq.com. Again, that's what we're helpful to enable for you. So again, it's not where the work gets done, it's how the work gets done overall. And so I'll leave it back over to you, MC, to take us home.
Yeah, cool. And just one comment on with Karbon. Was it last week or 2 weeks ago, Ian, you did a webinar announcing the integration now with Practice Ignition, which is very exciting.
Yeah, so if you want to take the actual sales process and marry it straight to the work system to your client onboarding, we launched that integration literally 2 weeks ago, and it just, whatever you decide to actually, you decide on your proposal that the client has actually agreed to, it actually will create all those work items, including the client onboarding process, automatically within your work system. So it's pretty cool. So
Practice Ignition and Karbon are each very powerful apps. The fact that they integrate now, that's wonderful efficiencies available to firms. One last thing to let everyone know about, the strategy fast track. Our next intake for that is on January 17. So this won't apply to everyone at that time of year, because depending on your family situation, you might be holidaying or camping or doing something like that, sharpening the saw. But I do know, particularly younger firms, you may well be working on your business come January because it's quiet time, chance to do slow thinking. So our strategy fast track is a 6-week process where we take you through getting utter clarity on what we call the 7 big rocks of strategy. And these are the things that you must get right first before you do silver bullet marketing, which is my term for thinking that any one thing in your marketing is going to make a big difference, such as a website in and of itself won't fix your marketing. SEO in and of itself will not. Paid traffic, Facebook, Google ads won't. Marketing automation won't. All of those things are useful when layered on top of strategy. So in this process, we essentially help you get that foundation solidly in place. And we address strategy and digital presence so that at the end of the 6-week process, you are ready to roll out what we call the digital marketing machine to crank out great content. But without strategy, it's all a waste of time. So if you want to find out more, just email us. You can see the email address at the top of the screen, hello@practiceparadox.com.au, and one of our digital marketing advisors, and we specialize globally just in accounting and related advisory firms. So that includes progressive bookkeeping firms, financial advisory firms. So we're inch wide, mile deep in that globally. One of our digital marketing advisors will just have a chat with you about what Fast Track is, how it's delivered, and how you can get on board for the next intake. So thanks so much, Ian, for today. That was a brilliant share. There's your email address if anyone wants to message you personally as well.
Yep.
And I'll hand over to you to just say final goodbyes.
No, I appreciate everybody. Again, all just on the client onboarding, make sure you stay focused. Think about how to get it from start to finish as fast as possible. And again, just make sure you're delivering to the client and teaching them each and every step along the way. So again, if you have any questions, happy to answer them anytime. My email's up there at ian@karbonhq.com. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me today.
It's been a pleasure, Ian, to have you and your dog. All right. We'll talk again soon. Thanks, Ian. And bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.